Good afternoon and a warm welcome to all of you to this webinar, which will be looking at a recently published book, which is Culture as Power, Buddhist Heritage and the Indo-Japanese Dialogue. And in this connection, I would very much like to extend a very warm welcome to all our very distinguished panelists. Professor Madhu Bhalla, who has edited this particular volume. We have Professor Madhavan Palak, a very, very distinguished academician. We have Mrs. Aparna Vaidik, who will also be speaking to us. She has tremendous background in India-Japan relations in particular. And Himanshu Prabhare, who actually was the person who I first spoke to in trying to see whether we could actually organize an international conference on this very subject. So it was in August 2018 that we convened this conference with the same heading. And the idea was to bring together both Indian as well as Japanese scholars to look at a particular period of history, a very important period of history, which we felt was somehow neglected in much of the discourse on India-Japan relations, which is the period in the the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. This was a period of great, turmoil in a sense all over Asia, but it was also a period where there were a lot of stirrings of national sentiment across the board in many countries in Asia which were under colonial rule. And in that context, we were looking at how the emergence of Japan as one of the first Asian countries, in a sense, to become modern in the Western sense, and also gather enough national strength, for example, in defeating Russia, and thereby, in a sense, exploding the myth of Western invincibility. And this had a tremendous impact on other Asian countries. And this began also the movement to try and hark back to some of the ancient connections amongst the Asian countries. A sense of pan-Asianism began to emerge, in which the Buddhist heritage shared by many of these countries played a very important role. So this conference had a number of excellent presentations, really exploring this aspect of the reconnecting of Asia, which took place as a result of these very seminal movements taking place across Asia. So that's the backdrop to this seminar that we are having today. And I would very much like to thank all our very distinguished panelists for having agreed to participate in this webinar. So without further ado, I would like to first call on Professor Madhu Bhalla, who has edited this volume based on the proceedings of the conference, to perhaps present us with a brief overview of the book. If she can limit herself to about 10 minutes or so, I would be very grateful. Professor Bhalla, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. It actually lays the ground for what I'm going to say about the book itself. The interesting part about this whole project was that it started as an idea. And when Himanshu and I first talked about it, we were actually talking about the impulse behind the UNESCO's transcription of World Heritage Sites and the significance of cultural diplomacy as an effective tool in extending national influence, state influence. And we also felt that there was a focus on defining Buddhist sites across Asia, whether it was in China, India, or Japan. And there was behind this impulse of states to define Buddhist sites an effort also to actually control that focus on these sites and to make claims on behalf of Buddhism for policy as well as for their own people and the affiliation with their own people. This raised the question for us on, whether claims to Buddhism, its origins, its sacred sites, its beliefs and practices needed to be divisive. That is, should all countries just be doing this on their own and competing in these claims, or whether the contemporary interest in Buddhism has actually can lend itself to an idea of Asian unity. And when we talked about that idea of Asian unity, we went back to, a prehistory of that idea in a manner of speaking. We do know that Pan-Asianism was a very large part of the Japanese endeavor, after the 1930s in Asia. And there was a fatal flaw in this idea of Pan-Asianism, but there was also a prehistory to this notion of Asian unity and Pan-Asianism. So we went back to that idea, and we felt that in a sense, because the current focus on Buddhist connections had begun to create a new cultural ecology in Asia, whether in fact we could look at earlier culturalist views of Asian unity. And we felt we were, of course, aware of the fact that a lot has been written on Buddhism in the ancient period, on its soteriology, on the recovery of Buddhist texts, and a much more textual understanding of Buddhism. So there's a vast literature on that. But much of that literature doesn't actually, look at what happened to this debate on Buddhism at the high moment of imperialism and colonialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And because these debates around that time, which emerged around the time of the Parliament of Religions, 1893, etc., were actually obscured by discussions of aesthetics and philosophy. And we began to look at this, and we felt that really Asian relations, any discussion on Asian relations, had wholly been cast in the pre-colonial or the post-colonial period. So pre-colonial period, Asia had connections, whether they were in the ancient period or even the medieval period. And of course, in the post-colonial period, after the Second World War, Asian states start to connect with each other again because they had agency. In the pre-colonial and the post-colonial periods, Asian states had agency and they could define their own material interests and therefore engage on their own terms with other Asian nations. But the interesting part to us was what happens when Asian states don't have, Asian subjects don't have agency as Asian states, as independent Asian states. What kind of conversations do Asians have with each other in those circumstances? Can they circumvent the very limited scope in which colonial political frameworks define these debates between Asians themselves? Can they work on the margins or from the margins to make new connections and create new sets of dialogues? And we found that, in many ways, we found that the literature in the area looked at the political context of some of these colonial, dialogues, or these dialogues under colonialism, but they didn't look at the political context in which these discussions took place, the response of colonial subjects to the overwhelming weight of colonial discourses on deciding the place of Asian histories, religions, and aesthetic achievements, and the racial stereotypes inherent in this, right? And these were largely understood, but barely investigated. So we thought that this, if we could hone in on one discursive event, significant discursive event in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the heyday of Western colonialism, we would be able to uncover, I think, many of both the political impulses of this cultural dialogue, as well as the strategies that these cultural dialogues actually took upon themselves to use. And this event was very brief, we thought. We looked at the Chicago Exposition, we looked at the Parliament of Religions, and we felt that there was a connection here. And of course, there was some literature on this previously. And we felt that the event for us was brief, but we felt it was also very productive in the way in which Indian and Japanese intellectuals around the time of the Chicago Exposition and thereafter actually took this dialogue forward. And there were many, many areas in which they took this dialogue forward. One, of course, was art and aesthetics. The other one was religion. We surprisingly found not just a few people who engaged in this, but a fairly large number of people who were involved in these debates and these dialogues, right? So Asian intellectuals, religious leaders, sundry travelers, they worked outside the constraints of formal structures of power to create the networks which also reflected their broader concerns about historical and cultural crises that these countries were facing. Japan, in the Meiji period, was debating all of these issues, actually, their cultural renaissance, the cultural reemergence, as well as the political and economic crisis of that period. And of course, in India, the Bengal Renaissance, and everybody who was involved in that was acutely conscious of the political and cultural crisis that colonialism had actually fraught. So this book is really about what happens when dialogues like these take place. And the discussions around unifying ideas and beliefs and the different colonial experiences and political trajectories that reveal tensions around the notions of Asianness or Asian unity. It is the book is also about how we may revive some of these dialogues, again, as Asian states which have a stake in Asia. So how do we revive these dialogues? If we had them at the most difficult period of our colonial history, can we now, when we have more agency, both Japan and India and other Asian states as well, can we actually revive these dialogues in a much more meaningful way, in a much more positive way, rather than making competing claims for common cultural heritage? Therefore, what this book has tried to do is it has tried to, in a manner of speaking, focus on the current interest in Buddhist connections, see whether there's a new cultural ecology in the making, and see whether, in fact, new symbols of ancient Buddhist connections can become the basis for shared values and knowledge. And what, if at all, Japan's post-war peace psyche contributes to an Asian dialogue? So these were the broad questions I think we had when we began to look at how we would, frame the conference out of which the book has finally emerged. Unfortunately for us, I think, and this was actually Himanshu's doing, not as much mine. Fortunately for us, when the invitations went out to scholars both in Japan, in India, as well as outside of in Australia and in Europe, we got very, very good responses. And I am not just saying that they said yes to us, but they wrote us brilliant papers, many of which are, actually all of them of which are in this book. So we have in this book actually a clear division between the first part of the book that is about the dialogue between Indian and Japanese intellectuals, religious leaders, etc. What this dialogue meant, the conditions in which it actually emerged, and what were the similarities that they wanted to actually deduce out of these dialogues, and eventually the limits of this sense of unity, which sort of stared them in the face because of the different political trajectories that each country took. So therefore, the dialogue itself, I think the first few chapters in this book are actually a very, very rich accounting of the many levels at which this dialogue took place. The prehistory of this dialogue in some ways, the xenology, as Amiya Sen says, of, this in colonial Bengal, the ways in which it affected, Indian intellectuals, the way in which it affected Japanese intellectuals, and the intellectuals who took part in these dialogues. To a large extent, the dialogues coalesced around religion and art. A religion because of the interest in Buddhism, because Buddhism became the unifying factor between the Japanese and the Indian intellectuals, and where even Hindu Indian intellectuals like Rabindranath Tagore were very interested in the way in which Buddhism, the essential beliefs of Buddhism, and the compassion and love that it actually, that was actually the central aspect of Buddhism for Tagore. So what we're looking at is that both around religion and around art, some of the leading figures of the Bengal Renaissance, Tagore, Abanindranath, Vivekananda, for example, some of the leading intellectuals from Sri Lanka, Kumaraswamy, the art historian, Dharmapala, the Buddhist scholar, and of course, leading art historians from Japan, Okakura Tenshin, took part in this dialogue. It's interesting to note that, these were difficult times. These were difficult times for making connections. Journeys took a long time. To sustain the interest in these dialogues was at times difficult because of not being able to meet each other. And yet, the dialogues were sustained by, for example, Okakura sending his student, after his visit to India, sending his students back to India to meet with Tagore, to meet with the Bengal Renaissance people, to meet with the Vichitra, people who were responsible for the Vichitra School of Art. And then, of course, carrying out, actually arranging exhibitions, both of the Vichitra School of Art as well as of the Ajanta, paintings. So what we are looking at is there was a concerted effort to actually, sustain this dialogue through both the material use of artifacts, of paintings, etc., but also the writing of letters, the publishing of journals, and as Judith Natar says, Young India became in Japan a very central journal where both Indians and Japanese were able to present their positions on this. So we are looking really at a fairly productive period, very short, very brief, but very, very productive in terms of what this engagement was. And both in religion and in the arts, the objective was to rethink what had become accepted scholarship on Indian religions, especially Buddhism, and Indian art. So, for example, there was a concerted effort to argue against the Western notion that the Gandhara school of art was influenced by the Greek tradition, by the Greeks. Whereas Okakura actually came to the conclusion that it was a vital Indian tradition. On Buddhism, there was a movement away from looking at the textual, hermeneutics of Western scholarship on Buddhism, and to look at Buddhism as a practice, as a religion in which people believed and the essential aspects of their religion. But central to this whole thing, of course, especially in religion and in art, was this notion of Advaita, where the unity of opposites and the unity of all things became a central focus of discussion and a central idea that ran through the debates during this period. Interestingly, of course, much of this fell by the wayside as political trajectories differed, as the heyday of Japanese nationalism emerged in the 1920s and 1930s, to some extent, Okakura's writings also lent themselves to this. And then, of course, this dismayed people like Rabindranath Tagore, who felt that the militarism of Japan would lead to a replication of what the West had already done under colonialism. So,
Professor Bhalla, may I ask you to please conclude soon, because we have other speakers.
Yes. Yes, just give me 5 minutes. So the first part of the book is a dialogue. The second part of the book is actually a discussion of what happened here. Is a discussion of how Buddhism plays a defining role in transnational identity, even today, even as national identities, sovereign interests are more clearly defined. In particular, we have the global vision coming out of the UNESCO's transcribing of heritage sites, the globalization of East Asian art. There's a very good paper on that in the Freer Museum of Art in the US, and as well as the dynamic use of Ajanta art by 20th century Japanese artists. So the globalization of art traditions is at the heart of the emergence of a global cultural ecology around Buddhism. And some of this re-emerges, I think, in the contemporary period now, which means that, in one sense, we are left with the question of whether we can actually revive what was at that point a hugely cosmopolitan, pluralist a moment of cultural openness and inquiry. Can we build on this? How do we build on this? And so the book leaves us with the question of how we can build on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor
You're
Bhalla, and my apologies for interrupting you,
No,
but
not at all.
we have a rather short period of time.
Yes,
I
sorry.
neglected to introduce Professor Bhalla, who's a former professor of Chinese Studies in the Department of East Asian Studies, University of Delhi. And she is currently the editor of India Quarterly at the Indian Council for World Affairs. She has, of course, taught at Jawaharlal Nehru University, at Queen's University in Canada, and has held a visiting fellowship at Fudan University in Shanghai, China. She's also been a visiting scholar at the University of Sichuan in Chengdu. She is, of course, has published very widely on international relations, on foreign policy issues relating to China, to East Asia. And her interests are in the connections, as we have just heard, between culture and power in foreign policy. She has also been part and parcel of several of the the second track dialogues between India and China, and is a member of several advisory bodies for China studies in India. So thank you, Professor Bhalla, for your introduction to this volume. As we have heard, I think what we have been looking at is why that particular period in history, recent history, is important in terms of refocusing our attention on certain aspects of Asian history. The Western influence, of course, that Professor Bhalla talked about is very important. A Western attitude towards Asian cultures was one of looking for how to prove that whatever was perhaps worthwhile in these cultures may have had some Western connection. So Gandhara art is a very important aspect of that. Or there was the element of exoticism, that what was not linked was something exotic, but not necessarily superior to Western culture. So in that context, it became very important for the Asian countries, as Professor Bhalla said, to really establish their own perspective, their own agency with regard to this history of connections between our countries. And we spoke about how difficult it was for people really to meet each other, to establish contact. Travel was not so easy, but in that sense, there is also a history of a much more ancient period where travel was perhaps even more hazardous, more difficult, where surprisingly, a lot of travel was taking place. The Buddhist scholars from India going to Southeast Asia, to China. Professor Himanshu Pravare has this very interesting story in her piece about Vajrabodhi, who sailed from Nagapattinam east with Persian merchant ships, and then reached Srivijaya in Indonesia in something like 1717, if I'm not mistaken, and then stayed there for about 3 years, and met his own student, Amogha Vajra, in Srivijaya, and then finally reached China in 720 AD. So even those days, when travel was so difficult, we find remarkably, how much of travel and interconnectedness there was in that particular period. So now I would now like to turn to Professor Madhu Bhalla, who is someone who has specialized in imperial Russian history of the 18th to the 20th century, also Indian history. And his other interests, of course, include modern European intellectual history. He has taught at the Center for Historical Studies, School of Social Sciences in the Jawaharlal Nehru University from 1974 until his voluntary retirement in 2004. He was senior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library from 1992 to 1995, visiting professor of Imperial Russian history at the University of Chicago for the spring quarter of 2003, National Fellow at the Indian Institute for Advanced Study in Shimla, 2010 and 2011. He is also well known for his edited selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru for the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund. So, Professor Bhalla, warm welcome to you, and we would be very happy to hear your views on this edited volume, which has been produced on India-Japan relations, which of course also has some connections with Imperial Russia, I would imagine. Thank you very much. Professor Bhalla, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chancellor. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I must say the book has been immensely stimulating. And the grounds have already been laid out so well by Madhu Bhalla, but the grounds on which I found it interesting, let me suggest myself three major points. The first is about the meeting of India and Japan in modern times, not only on the issues of global strategy and economic development, which we might have thought would be the biggest problem facing the two countries, or for comparisons about them, but really on the terrain of Buddhism. Japan is Buddhist. India is almost not Buddhist. Buddhism has become relatively marginal in India, or so it is assumed. But that is the terrain on which they have met, and that is what the book is about. But the point is that if it is not, that even if it is about Buddhism, the nature of the power relationships between the two countries and their situation in the world at that time could not be excluded. And so much of the discussion relates to those situations, how they place themselves in the world, and then how Buddhism is factored into it. Thus, Buddhism as a factor in the calculus of global power, not as crude propaganda, but at the exalted level of persons like Tagore and Okakura, how they saw it is especially fascinating. Now, we do have persons like Vivekananda and even Tagore treat Buddhism as not merely having originated in India, but as something of an emanation of the Upanishads. That is how it is seen here, and it has been shown in the book. By laying claim to Buddhism as something specifically Indian, at least in origin, and the further implication could be that Buddhists everywhere are beholden to India for some reason, or for that reason. Of course, they don't say it explicitly, but there's a suggestion at the back of this whole discussion to that extent. Of course, it has been made clear how Tagore was so universal in approach. He could never engage in any kind of chauvinism, naturally. That's not his type. But Vivekananda and Sister Nivedita came close to that. The manner in which they talked about Buddhism in relation to Hinduism, or rather the Upanishads and so on, suggests a certain degree of condescension of that kind. Now, given this, it is interesting that the relation between Japan and India through Buddhism, the Indian interlocutors were Hindu. They were not Buddhists, primarily, be it Tagore or Vivekananda or others. Where are the Buddhists in this relationship, one might ask? Of course, there was Dhammapada, but he's a significant figure from Sri Lanka, but it is not the Buddhists mainly. On the other side, it is the Buddhists. And even if they're meeting on the field of religion, were there any Christians who were interested. There was a good Christian community in East Asia, and of course in India. But did they link up, be it on the field of Buddhism or independently of it? Where does that figure? It'll be interesting to know a little more about such matters. Now, in this context, Okakura is especially interesting because of his global career from Japan to Boston, and his operating with the dichotomy of Eastern spirituality and Western materialism, where he sees an identity between India and Japan here. But more than that, if I have understood Shimizu right, he also rejected Japan's position in the imperialist or Western materialist league in favor of an identity with India. Now, this he did at a time when Japanese militarism was rising and when what has been called in the book a de-Asianization was taking place in Japan. That is, Japan was entering the league of the imperialists and distancing herself from Asia. Now, it is interesting to juxtapose this with Amartya Sen's account of Tagore, rejecting the dichotomy of Eastern spirituality and Western materialism, a favored subject the world over in the 19th century, I might say, starting with the Germans, going on through the Russians, and taking India and many other countries by storm. Now, Tagore rejected that, although the way he rejected it seems a trifle confused to me, as recorded as the quotation given on page 81. And he is asserting that Japan lacks spirituality, whereas the West has more of it. Now, this is an interesting position. Here he's making the point that the Japanese have been so obsessed with their militarism, industrialization, modernization, etc., and taking on all, as it were, the evils of the West so heartily that it became less spiritual than even the West was. And this is where Okakura and Tagore have much in common, that they are both dismayed by Japanese militarism and xenophobic nationalism. Now, Okakura was not only asserted the identity with India, but even a certain priority to India, with claims like the Indian Buddhist origins of Japanese art, almost like an Indian nationalist, one might say. And I especially liked the two references in the book to Vincent Smith's righteous colonial anger at the suggestion that Gandharan art could be more Chinese than Greek of inspiration. No, that won't do. It has to be Greek, because all good things are only from Greece, and hence Europe, was Vincent Smith's position. Well, Okakura gave a counter-argument to that, and that itself is of significance. So it would have been interesting to have heard a little more of the de-Asianization, as it has been called, in this whole context. We have much about Japanese nationalism, but what about the other side of it? Now, one big question, I thought, was, why was he so peculiarly identified with India and reject the West? Is it entirely due to his Buddhism? Or is it because it places him in a sort of comfort zone with India? Because Japan is such an advanced economy, and when relating to India, he doesn't have to face the barbs and prejudices that the West usually directed at Japan in those days. We must remember these are early times. So would that identification with India have something to do with that peculiar position of Japan, advanced but still treated with contempt by the West? The other point is Asianism, or Pan-Asianism even. Now, usually the subject is overwhelmed by Nehru's diplomacy and the discussion of the Asian Relations Conference and so on. But here we see a longer trajectory of the whole issue and the intellectual foundations from which it grew, and on which Nehru rested so much of his case. A number of essays here do examine what Asianism meant and what the authors of such ideas were trying to do with the concept. But most of all, it is fascinating to see how Asianism has been related to Buddhism specifically, rather than as an instrument of diplomacy and of great power politics. It embraces the asymmetrical relation of Japan and India, but with the Buddhist link between them. See, Japan was an advanced industrial country by then, which had entered the League of Imperialist Powers by the end of the 19th century already, signed a naval treaty with Britain, none less than Britain, in 1902, and had decisively defeated Russia in 1905. India was a colony until mid-century, and even in independence excruciatingly poor and dependent on many of the great powers. So how did the two relate to each other through this asymmetry? It meant different things at different times in the two countries, and that has been well explored in the book. In Japan, it could provide the support for Japanese imperial ambitions, the core prosperity sphere, which is akin to Hitler's ideas of European unity. Now, if you juxtapose this, Hitler's notions of European unification and Japanese notions of Asianism in its militarist phase, we find an uncomfortable similarity between the two. Both wanted unity of large continental spaces under their direct imperial control. So much of what is Asianism, what we understand of it as Asianism in India, and what it became in Japanese hands at that time are two very different things. But that doesn't mean you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just as the Europeans haven't thrown out the idea of European unity because Hitler sponsored the idea. Not at all. In India, it meant an anti-colonial front, eventually, which was in opposition to what Japan meant later in the century. And hence here, Tagore's polemic with Yone Noguchi is of special interest. And I like that. I wish we could have had a little more on that. And when I say I wish we could have had more, it is not a criticism of the book. It's reminding you how much we are stimulated by the book, that we want to come back for more. It gives us many new ideas. But still, the two Asianisms could come together under a Buddhist umbrella. And that is what is of interest here. Third point is, how was Buddhism for the modern world understood in both countries? And how far did it converge? Here, Lala Hardayal's contribution is the most clearly outlined one by Judith Snodgrass. It is exceptionally useful. Now, he is especially important because he wanted a religion for the modern scientific and rational world. He thought that the world could not live without Buddhism, without a religion. And he found that Buddhism fitted the bill, as it did, interestingly, for many Christians during the crisis of faith of the 19th century in Britain. Many people in Britain were so attracted to Buddhism for precisely this reason. It did not have all the burdens of Christianity dogging them. Now, Indians did have the option of making Hinduism and Islam suitable for the modern world, transforming it accordingly, and many did so. And they did it in the manner that Christians did in Europe with Christianity, make it compatible with modernity and science. But India had the added problem of communal animosity, chiefly between Hindu and Muslim. And Buddhism came in very useful here as providing a soothing balm. This was one of Lala Hardayal's interests, and this was very much Nehru's attraction, the basis of Nehru's attraction to Buddhism. So we see how Buddhism actually brings together ideas of secularization, where people are looking for a religion that is not a religion, and in India especially a religion that is almost gone from India, but nonetheless will provide a wonderful balm to the extremely contested position of the religions in the country. But India had a further exceptional problem, that is caste. And here again, Buddhism provided, in this case, an exit route, and hence Ambedkar's choice. So Buddhism had all these possible roles to play in India, although Buddhism was relatively marginal. In Japan, what was the nature of the use of Buddhism as a modern scientific religion in the context of these discussions? It would have been interesting to hear more about precisely that. But the final part of the book, especially about the art and the manner in which the art was absorbed, Buddhist art was absorbed from India into Japan, and the way it went around the world and so on, is, I find, especially useful and interesting. But these big 3 points that I have highlighted are the ones that I took from the book and are laid out principally in the first part and spilling over into the second. Thank you very much once again for having brought out such a book, and thank you everyone for giving me the time to speak on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Palat, for those very perceptive comments. And I think you have given us a number of very interesting insights of what, in fact, this role of Buddhism in terms of, the concept of Asianness that, seem to have brought particularly India and Japan together. There is also a Chinese angle to it, which, as someone who has been associated with Chinese studies, also I find very interesting how the Japanese, Chinese, and Indian concepts of Asianism and what that constituted, and what role Buddhism played in that context. Again, very interesting. But what you mentioned about a certain condescending nature of India as its own middle kingdom as far as Buddhism is concerned. I think here is the problem that as a practitioner I came across every once in a while in serving in Asia, that how much there is, in fact, you see the colors and sounds of India no matter where you go, but it is not India. I think what we have to recognize is that the genius of India lay in the fact that we provided a kind of a spark which led to a kind of a cultural efflorescence in many of these countries, and created, in fact, channels of communication in multiple spheres between India and these countries. So the uniformity which is underlying, say, the co-prosperity sphere must be contrasted with a much more, shall I say, pluralistic, much more inclusive, perhaps less structured kind of affinities, I would say, rather than connections, affinities which actually grew almost by an osmotic process through the interchange amongst the countries of the region. And if we are looking at what the new role could be in terms of reconnecting Asia, it's very important that you keep to that aspect of our history rather than thinking in terms of some kind of a dominant unifying element that necessarily must be the basis for this new Asianness. But very interesting comments from you, sir. Thank you very much indeed. Very stimulating. I would now like to call upon Professor Aparna Vaidik, Associate Professor of History from Ashoka University. Aparna Vaidik has formerly taught at Georgetown University in the US, offering courses such as Nation and Nationalism, Indian Ocean in the Age of Empire, Politics of Violence, Gandhi and World History, and Colonialism and Culture. She has also served on comprehensive exam and dissertation committee of several graduate students, taught at the University of Delhi for 5 years during and after her PhD, teaching subjects ranging from classical antiquity, Russian Revolution, to the history of modern China and Japan. Professor Vedic is also the author of Imperial Andamans, Colonial Encounter and Island History. Her forthcoming books include Awaiting Swaraj, Ascetic Imagination and Revolutionaries in Dialogue, and My Son's Inheritance, A Secret History of Blood Justice and Lynchings in India. These are forthcoming publications. So, Professor Vedic, now you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you, Professor Ray, for inviting me to the event. I'm really honored to be, I read the book, really enjoyed it, and to be speaking with Professor Palat, my teacher from JNU. So I'm coming to this really as somebody who's been looking at ideas of nationalism, violence, and history of Indian Ocean, not really as an expert on Japan or Buddhism. So I was speaking to Professor Ray and I said, how should I go about reading it? And she said, read it with your eyes. So what I'm going to give you is the way I read the book and what I got out of it. So first, I'll just summarize few of the elements I thought the book that were new in the book, and that were new historiographical interventions. So the book first helps us address a significant historiographical oversight. Now, this material was new to me, entirely new to me, because it refocuses the attention of Indian art, history, and aesthetics onto Asia in a way. And it does it with the help of Japanese sources. So, and this has already been said by Ambassador Saran and Professor Ray have already raised this point, that so far we have been focusing, whenever we do Gandhara art or any of these Buddhist art, we are always looking at the Greco-Roman influences. And really the fact that a lot of this art was actually had Chinese influence in it, and how the Japanese went about documenting that, and how that history of Japanese documentation of Chinese influence on Indian art was set aside in art history is what this book locates for us. So that I think, that was, I think, new for me. Then also the influence, the discovery in Japan of how a lot of their art also had Chinese influence. So China as an important catalyst, not just India, but China as an important catalyst, aesthetic and art and the domain of art in the 19th and 20th century was interesting to read about. And also it was interesting to see how the Japanese Buddhists came to see India as the home of Buddhism. And this happens in 19th century and not before. So, so these historiographical shifts that the book makes make for very interesting read. Now, the second thing the book did for me was it enriched the history of Buddhism. It provided a story of modern Buddhist cosmopolis. So you have Sheldon Pollock talking about Sanskrit cosmopolis, and there have been works, Seema Alvi and Sugata Bose have written about the Islamic cosmopolitanism. And here what you see is the modern Buddhist cosmopolis and how it came about. And that it wasn't always like Buddhism's history was not an unbroken chain. So this is the intervention that comes in the 19th century, and there's a creation of this sort of Buddhist cosmopolis, and how it becomes a shared cultural frame, but does not last also. So, and how Victorian England and colonialism provides a framework within which this Buddhist cosmopolis comes about. And I'll return to this in the end about why, because I was left asking, why does it not stick? Why does it not hold? What is it about this history that makes it so ephemeral? Or why are the ambivalences? Why are there so many ambivalences in it? Third, there has been an entire a school of sort of writing about how Asian nationalism or Pan-Asianism happened in 20th century. Now, there's one very famous book that came out a few years ago, which was Erez Manella's Wilsonian movement. Now, Erez Manella actually saw the coming together of Asian nationalisms as a result of Wilsonian policy. Yeah, so he marks Paris Peace Conference of 1919 as an important moment where all the Asiatic leaders came together for a dialogue. And although the book has been critiqued, but 1919 is seen as this moment of coming together of Asian nationalism. But actually, interestingly, this book puts the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in September 1893, which was held for about 17 days, as the moment where this coming together begins. And then the book leads up to about 1930s. And so it sort of pushes back the genealogy in some ways. And there are quite a few articles that address this. Like you've already heard Professor Bhalla talk about Vivekananda, and there are Sri Lankan Buddhists there are Japanese Buddhists there who come to the conference, and how that sort of re-energizes or recreates the Buddhist cosmopolis. Now, the fourth element that the book touched upon was absence of state. Yeah, so what it is really documenting is individuals moving between different worlds. And these are artists, philosophers, religious men, collectors, and organizations backed where they are prominent individuals and they are moving across the spaces. So what the book also brings out is the significance of overland travel and interoceanic connections. So in that much, this book also contributes to the historiography of Indian Ocean, especially Professor Ray's article on how there are lots of heritage sites all along the Indian Ocean that need to be recognized by UNESCO as World Heritage Sites, and not many have been recognized. So in that much, it sort of opens up a new door into the history of the Indian Ocean, and also contributes to the large historiography on travel during the colonial period, and the gaze of the traveler, how travelers engage with each other, and of Asiatic travelers traveling to each other's country, not just Asiatics traveling to the Occident or the white travelers coming to the so-called quote-unquote Orient. So this is a different kind of an exchange, and the book sheds light on that. Now, for me, I'll just quickly talk about some of my takeaways and how I read them and my own critical reading about the book. Now, the book is addressing the idea of internationalism. Now, this is not the communist internationalism, but internationalism in the form of Pan-Asianism. Now, what one would have liked was this idea to have been pushed a little bit more. How are we understanding Pan-Asianism? Is it a state of mind? Is it a vision? Was it simply a rhetoric? Or was it a discursive formation? Or Pan-Asianism is really what Benedict Anderson calls an imagined community, where everybody's imagining themselves as equally oppressed or having to grapple with the West, and that generating certain kinds of questions about who are we, what are we, how should we regenerate, and all of that. So what does this internationalism actually mean? Now here I found, there is this one book by Chinese historian Rebecca Karl. The book is called Staging the World. And I found that useful in terms of understanding this Pan-Asianism. Now, she also makes this point and about Asian unity or Pan-Asianism, internationalism being at best ephemeral and ambiguous. It doesn't stick, it doesn't hold. And she's saying that this actually provides us into understanding Asian nationalisms in a different way, because Asian nationalisms have often been studied as derivative. They are derivative of the liberal language or the bourgeois nationalisms of the language that is coming from the West. But she's saying that can we move away from this way of examining nationalisms? And instead, what we can do is to understand the worldliness of the Asian nationalisms. That these Asian nationalisms are articulating themselves in a world that, in an age, in a period that has a greater sense of being in the world, that has a greater sense of being connected, and yet it is grappling with something really provincial, particular, and local. So these nationalisms owe allegiance to the universals and to the particulars. And it's interesting in this case that the universalism that is talked about is Buddhism. So how Buddhism works as a universalizing or universalist philosophy for Pan-Asianism. So, so that, and the second idea I thought that came through, but we can push that a little bit more, is how we engage with modernity. Now, this, there is a lot of work on this, on that modernity should be in plural, modernism, and alternate modernities, multiple modernities. So the idea has been done to death. But at the heart of this idea, this idea fundamentally thrives on one binary, which is the binary between East and West. Yeah, where the West is the progenitor or the cradle of modernity, and modernity becomes an export that is sent out to the rest of the world. And this idea holds the binary in place of East and West. Now, the question for a historian is, are there ways of dissolving the historical limitations of the construct East and West? These constructs or these categories, can we dissolve them? Can we go past them? And, before the event started, I was asking Professor Palat if he's going to talk about anarchism, because, there's some work now where Japanese scholars have looked at Russian archives, and they are drawing new lineages of history of anarchism. Yeah, and the book mentions, one of the articles mentions Lala Hardayal, but there is also Raj Bihari Bose. There are several Indian revolutionaries who make Japan their home in this period. Yeah, and one of them, Raj Bose, goes on to open a curry restaurant in Japan. Yeah, so one populist revolutionary leader, I just want to briefly talk about him. So there's this Russian international leader. In 1874, Lev Mechnikov goes to Japan, to participate and observe Meiji Restoration. And it's from there, while he's observing that society, he feels, not everything is being done by the Meiji Restoration, but the Tokugawa period actually had, or Japan already had something in it which has brought it to this point. And that something was this idea of mutual aid. And with that, he puts forward a vision of cooperativist anarchist civilization and progress. And this idea later is taken up by Kropotkin. And here in Japan, he saw the universal possibility of cooperating cooperating anarchist human progress that transcended the provincial claims of the Slavophiles. So I feel that looking at the anarchism arc or anarchism cosmopolis actually helps us dissolve these binaries between East and West, and to see how there is a flow of ideas, not just in terms of Buddhism, but flow of ideas from Japan to other places as well. Not just to Japan from India and China, but from Japan to other places. And also the missing, one of the variables in the picture, other than China, is Russia. So I wonder if Russian archives has more on, can shed more light on history of Japan.
Thank you, Professor Vaidik. May I ask you to please conclude in a couple of minutes, because we are running out of time.
Sure. So now I also, came to this thing of Ambedkar, what Professor Palat mentioned, that one of the afterlives of Buddhism is in the context of Dalit resistance and the way Ambedkar takes it up. And that is in interesting contrast to the Mahayana version of Buddhism of Japan and the Navayana that he starts. So what happens to those lineages? What happens to those trajectories? Now, the last reflection I have is, what does drawing on history of this historical exchange do for us? What value does dipping into the past to recover moments that Asians came together help us? And why was this exchange short-lived? Why was it limited to only a few people? And what has kept us from coming together to protect Buddhist heritage sites post-World War II? And here I felt that somewhere histories of cultural and diplomatic exchanges actually invisibilize historical violence. Yeah, and that historical violence is the one I encountered in my research in the history of Andamans. Its occupation by the Japanese and they having carried out a genocide there. And then again in Malaysia of the Chinese. So somewhere I feel that those histories of violence are the ones that actually get silenced, and they are the ones that actually cause ruptures in these burgeoning ties. And this is what Ashish Nandi also says in Intimate Enemy, that in the moment of encounter, lots of subcultures which were earlier recessive are brought to fore. Yeah, but why is it that in this moment of encounter between India, China, and Japan, it is the element of tradition that appears the most universalist and most peaceable, with most peaceable overtones that is picked up. Yeah, and then it is later silenced by violence. So just something for us to think about on why are these connections so ephemeral. And going forward, maybe we want to do a little bit more research on Studio Ghibli. Yeah, those are the new connections that India has with Japan. All the movies, the J-pop, the manga comics, the anime, Pokemon. Yeah, so Haruki Murakami. So I think these are the new ways, new ties that are there, not as much as religion, but this pop culture. So I'll stop here.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Vedic. That was a very refreshing perspective on the subject from a very different angle. And you are quite right that there are several streams of thought which we ought to look at, not just look at the Buddhist element, because there were lots of other streams of encounters that they were taking place around this time. And it is also perhaps worth focusing attention on putting the India-Japan relationship in a somewhat broader context. I, for example, find it always very interesting to see how, for example, China was deriving its perceptions of India from what the Japanese were looking at India during that time. And also, in a certain sense, how the Japanese were, in a sense, adopting some of the perspectives that the Chinese were putting forward with respect to India. So these interconnections also become quite interesting in terms of looking at this whole revival of Asianism in our region. So much more to study, so much more to learn. Actually, thank you very much indeed. So let me now come to Professor Himanshu Prabha Ray, who actually was in a sense the architect of this whole initiative. Putting together what turned out to be an extremely stimulating conference that we had, looking at different aspects of India-Japan encounters during this particular special period. And this was really a result of a conversation, very interesting conversation that I had with Professor Ray, because I was myself looking at this particular period. But of course, I was looking at it from a perspective on India-China relations as a subset of that relationship during that time, which was also very, very important. Same Rabindranath Tagore, who went to Japan, also traveled to China, and that was a period where these three countries were involved in a very complicated sort of relationship. So I was very interested in looking at also this India-Japan dimension to the subject. And I think Professor Himanshu Prabha Ray did an absolutely incredible job in bringing together a set of very interesting scholars who really contributed a great deal to our understanding of this particular period. So, Professor Ray, you have the floor. Please tell us how you see this book and its contents.
Thank you very much, and no, I'm very pleased with the way it has gone, the way discussion has gone, and Ambassador Shamsaran, you've already laid the field and talked about how the conference came about. So I'm just going to go back to the conference and with some nostalgia, and just share with you the kind of vibrancy and dynamism that really resulted in this conference. Not so much as it was planned, but it was just that everybody became so enthusiastic about the idea and did their very best. So just bear with me. I'd like to share screen and share some images with you about the conference, and how it came about. So I hope my screen is visible. Is that right? Is my PowerPoint visible or not yet?
Well, it's very small. We can't really make out what there is in it.
You'll
have to expand it.
Ma'am, just open your presentation. Right now we see your Google Chrome browser.
Okay. Yeah. Is it better now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to talk in the sort of short time that I have. I will not talk about the book. The book has already been discussed and very well. And thank you for all the suggestions. But I'm going to talk about the conference and the way in which the conference came together. And certainly that time IIC was celebrating the Japan year, and Ambassador Shamsaran pushed this idea of, can we talk about cultural heritage, which is something which I was interested in. So I'd like to highlight three aspects of this conference. There certainly was, in my mind, and the takeaway that I have, cultural heritage. There was, of course, this heritage being discussed in the context of India and Japan, but as a dialogue which took place within the larger world. So it was not, usually you see just, two countries and what the influence between them was. But what we were attempting to do was to place this dialogue within a larger world order. The conference was sponsored by both the Institute of China Studies and also by IIC. And I must say this, and I would like to really put this forward in sort of stronger terms, that the recent AGBM of IIC was sort of looking at moving away from research, but I would press that with Ambassador Shamsaran supporting this conference, I think we should continue with the initiative of looking at research themes and engaging with them. And this conference was a great example of how research scholars came together. It was not just the research scholars. We had the ambassador, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Japan. He came to the inaugural session. You can see him in the middle. And he presented the keynote address. What we also had was participation, not just by the ICS, but also by the universities. On the left-hand side, you have the three images where the session on cultural heritage spoke about the importance of documentation. This has already been mentioned. Ajanta paintings, the Horyuji Temple at Nara, and also the East Asian collection at Freer Art Gallery. As the chair of that session, we had Professor Datta from the School of Art and Aesthetics, JNU, and of course, Kapilaji. And this session was extremely important for me because not just of my own personal interest, I learned a lot, but also it brought home to me the whole aspect that we seldom talk about Asian, what was happening in Asia at that point. We always talk about the West, about, the colonial understanding of Indian art, but very seldom do we get to hear scholars from other parts of Asia talking about how they looked at the past, at monuments, and at paintings. Another aspect, which has already again been highlighted, but I'd just like to draw it out because that's something which came across at the conference as well, was the aspect of dialogue. A.K. Kumaraswamy, yes, we know of him as an art historian, and Okakura Kakutsu has been discussed a great deal in terms of Pan-Asianism and Asian art. But what I think is missing in this whole field, and is missing to this point, is how was the art history of Buddhism defined in the 19th and 20th century? We talk about this definition of art history in India, or we talk about the definition of art history in the West, but seldom do we look at other countries and compare and contrast with what was happening elsewhere. And again, this slide and the 3 slides here, the slide on top with Ranjana Mukhopadhyay from Delhi University, and the students, not just of JNU, Center for Historical Studies, but also the younger research fellows from ICS and our younger colleagues, I thought really contributed to this conference and made the discussion very vibrant. So it was really a conference from which I learned personally a great deal, and also which provided me certain threads which I could research further. So the challenges that I still see today is how do we look at cultural heritage? I think we seldom look at it at the intersections of diplomacy, history, art history, and heritage. All these are treated as silos. We've grown up thinking of our own discipline and our own field as the most important, and that goes for all of us. But I think interdisciplinarity, and something which I would strongly suggest that IISc continues its policy of promoting interdisciplinarity, both in terms of research and conferencing and bringing together research scholars, is something to benefit from across universities, across academia, across a whole range of other professions and disciplines. We also had the MEA secretary giving the final valedictory address. Unfortunately, I don't have an image or a visual of that valedictory address and his honoring of some of the students who were present there. So it was really an exercise in bringing together interested scholars, interested researchers from a range of universities, fields, and to get them into dialogue. And that, for me, was very important. The second point, which again has come up both in terms of something which can be taken forward, but something which we also need to think about, is how does transnationalism and nationalism, how do we sort of balance them together? And how do we really move this forward as we think of the 21st century? But finally, and I will close with that because I'm aware of the time, and I would like also to see if we have question answers, is I still think, and this is a completely under-researched theme, is the fact that all, and I say that very sort of thinkingly, that all the knowledge paradigms that we teach, that we research within the different disciplines, history, archaeology included, are really drawn from the colonial period. And we really need to restructure these knowledge paradigms and challenge and question their creation in the colonial period. So for me, the conference was a learning experience. I'm really thankful to IISc, to Ambassador Shamsaran for this opportunity and giving me this clear hand to go ahead and structure it the way I wanted it. So thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for the excellent discussions that we've had today. And I hand it back to Ambassador Shamsaran.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Himanshu, for your presentation and taking us back to the whole idea of the conference and what were the takeaways from that. I think the last point that you made about how our knowledge systems are still structured along the colonial lines. This is something which comes up again and again. Just before this conference, if you remember, we also had a conference on India and Southeast Asia links. And there also it was very interesting that some of the Southeast Asian scholars who came to the conference made precisely the point that you are making, that the lens through which we are looking at our history is a lens which has been provided by the West. And unless we get away from that lens and create our own, it may be very difficult to get away from some of the prejudices that continue to linger on in the way we look at each other. So thank you very much. I would like to thank all our panelists for their very valuable contributions, very stimulating, insights that they have given us. Professor Bhalla, would you like to just moderate perhaps the question and answer session? Are there any questions that have been posed, or are there people who would like to take part in perhaps offering some comment or asking some question from our panelists?
There are no questions, but we have a comment by Joya Bose saying that the reason we can't arrive at new paradigms is because we don't know the languages of the cultures that we research. So that's a broad sort of indictment of what we do in our universities. And it's been repeated every so often, but I think in universities, in my experience, certainly universities, we don't really put our money where our mouth is on this one. So, that's something that I think planners and policy planners will have to think about. And the second comment is from a gentleman from Dehradun who has apparently written a book on the spiritual journey to East Asia, the spiritual journey of Buddhism to East Asia. And he appreciates the conference, the discussion. That's what we have so far, right? So
since there are no further questions or comments, may I ask each one of our panelists perhaps to take a minute or so and give us some final thoughts? Professor Palak, would you like to just offer a few final comments? You are muted, I think.
Okay. No, I don't have anything. I've immensely enjoyed and profited from the discussion. And I see we are 20 minutes overdue over our time. So I should not delay any further. So thank you very much, everything. And I've taken notes on everything.
Okay. Professor Vaidik?
There is a question for Professor Vaidik. Do you want to take that?
Okay.
It's just
Professor Vaidik can take that question.
Okay, it says, this is for Aparna from Shail Mariam. And it says, the moment of Buddhist cosmopolitanism is also ironically the one in which it becomes bounded and defined as a religion, and also anti-cosmopolitanism. What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, it's an atheistic, it has no conception of God, and it gets defined as religion actually in this moment. So absolutely. Thank you for that, Professor Madam.
Yeah.
Okay. And there is one question from Saurabh Kumar. If somebody wants to reply to that one. How do you understand the rise of Japanese militarism in the 19th century with its Buddhist heritage?
Yeah. Oh, well, you have lots of militant Buddhists.
Yes.
Well, the answer to that is why not? Buddhism doesn't prevent you from being militarist. It is one of the constructions of Buddhism in the 19th century that it was a perfect, compassionate religion of the Hinayana kind or whatever that the British Buddhologists created. But any ideology can be militarist, provided you tweak it well enough. And sure enough, and you can do the opposite to it also. So there's nothing very surprising about it.
And we have a long tradition of ascetic warriors, the Nathpanthis and the Nagas. And it's there in Hinduism. So being ascetic or being
I think
religious doesn't preclude arms.
Yes, yeah.
There's also a tradition in Japan. There's also a tradition in Japan of Buddhist nuns being warriors, right?
Yeah.
And actually fighting battles. And we see the same thing now. I think we saw the same thing in, well, not of warriors, but certainly Buddhists being terribly militant in Sri Lanka, as well as Myanmar.
In Myanmar. Yeah.
So,
In Rakhine State, for example.
It doesn't preclude militancy.
And interesting aside.
Let me give the last word to, sorry, Professor Palath, you wanted to say something?
Yes. An amusing point. The unarmed warfare supposedly went from Kerala Buddhists to East Asia. And so on. So Buddhists
the Chinese will not agree, by the way. The Chinese
will not
agree.
Okay, we will not claim any authorship. But point is that it is Buddhist monks who perfected it.
Quite right.
And that is interesting.
Quite right. Last word to Professor Himanshu Prabhare.
Okay,
Before I
thank you.
close.
I wanted to come on that point that was made earlier to Aparna by Shail Mayaram about Buddhism being a religion. I think this is the whole problem. You know, when we look at Buddhism in continuity, and I don't want to lecture now at this point, we're already over, but the whole notion of Buddhism being ethical, this is a Victorian notion, for heaven's sake. You know, this is something which the British gave it to us, and we inherited and, took it hook, line, and sinker. So that there was no ritual in Buddhism, I mean, I can give you references, but I think I need to stop there because I think the whole idea of this conference, and something which, which we discussed and which also comes out in the book, is the way in which the 19th and 20th century constructed a past, constructed a religion for that past. And, we don't see that. We just see it as a sort of continuation from, the Harappan civilization to the present. But I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
We need for you, hey, Himanshu, to write a
Yes.
new version of The Light of Asia.
Sure, I'll do
One
that.
last thing. I'd like to display the book
Okay,
itself
thank you.
Oh,
to
thanks.
everybody who's on the program. Right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting, conversation amongst our very distinguished panelists. I won't sum up what we have discussed. I think the conversation itself brought up some very new, insights, which I think we need a series of conferences to actually
Exactly.
explore
Yes.
some of those ideas. And I do hope, despite some reservations that Himanshu has about IIC's program of work, I hope we can keep it oriented in that direction. Thank you very much.
I would very much welcome. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
And thank you to IIC for organizing this webinar, and also to the Institute for Chinese Studies who cooperated very closely with us
Yes.
in making this event possible. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.